The air in the gilded cage was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and secrets. Elena gripped her glass, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. $10,000, her friend whispered, nodding toward the man sitting alone in the corner booth. He was a silhouette of sharp lines and dark gravity, his eyes scanning the room with the calculated chill of a predator. He looked like a king who had outlived his enemies. Elena didn't need the money, but she needed to feel alive. She stood up, smoothed her black dress, and walked toward the most dangerous man in the city, unaware that her life, as she knew it, ended the moment his lips met hers. The sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains of Elena's apartment felt intrusive, a stark contrast to the dim, velvet-soaked atmosphere of the gilded cage from the night before. She sat at her small kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she cradled a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom pressure of Nikolai Volkov's lips against hers, a reckless, $10,000 mistake that now felt like a brand on her skin. She was a creature of cautious routine, a woman who had spent years carefully curating a life of quiet anonymity to escape the stifling shadows of her past. But that morning, the silence of her apartment felt heavy, charged with the electricity of the night before, as if the very air was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She dressed for work with mechanical precision, choosing a conservative blouse and slacks that felt like a suit of armor compared to the daring black dress she'd worn for the dare. She told herself that Nikolai Volkov was just a man, a powerful, dangerous man, certainly, but a man who likely had far more important things to worry about than a girl who had kissed him on a whim. Yet, as she stepped out of her building, the familiar sights of her neighborhood felt skewed, as if the lens through which she viewed her reality had been smudged. The black sedan idling at the end of the block wasn't unusual for Harbor City, but the way the tinted window rolled down just an inch as she passed made the hair on her arms stand up. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, the same frantic rhythm she'd felt when she first approached Nikolai's booth. She ducked into her local coffee shop, her eyes scanning the reflected surfaces of the windows with a newfound paranoia. A man in a nondescript gray jacket was standing by the newsstand across the street, his gaze fixed too intently on the shop's entrance. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a shadow, professional and perfectly integrated into the morning rush. When she arrived at the boutique where she worked, a small, unmarked box sat on the counter. Her manager, Martha, gave her a curious look. "A courier dropped that off 10 minutes ago, Elle. No name, just yours." Elena's fingers fumbled with the ribbon, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, resting on a bed of dark silk, was a single, perfectly preserved gold-dipped rose. There was no note, but she didn't need one. It was a message, clear and cold. The world of the gilded cage hadn't stayed behind those heavy oak doors. It had followed her home. The morning progressed in a blur of anxiety. Every time the bell above the boutique door chimed, Elena's heart spiked. She found herself rearranging the same rack of silk scarves 3 times, her mind racing through every possible consequence of her impulsive act. She was used to being invisible, a face in the crowd that no one bothered to remember. But Nikolai Volkov didn't forget. At noon, she stepped into the break room to splash cold water on her face. When she looked in the mirror, she saw the sharp lines of her face and the hidden fire in her eyes that her friends had always teased her about. But today, that fire looked like a beacon for trouble. As she reached for a paper towel, she noticed something pinned to the bulletin board that hadn't been there when she arrived. It was a Polaroid. Her blood turned to ice. The photo was of her, taken from across the street just 20 minutes ago, through the boutique's front window. She was mid-sentence, talking to a customer, looking entirely unaware of the lens focused on her. On the white border of the photo, a single word was written in elegant, masculine script, claimed. Elena crumpled the photo in her fist, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wasn't just being watched, she was being hunted. The realization that Nikolai Volkov viewed her as a mark of his territory felt both terrifying and strangely intoxicating, a dangerous cocktail she wasn't prepared to drink. She realized then that the invisibility she had worked so hard to maintain had been shattered by a single moment of impulsivity. She wasn't just Elena anymore, she was the woman who had dared to touch the untouchable. Nikolai Volkov hadn't just kissed her, he had claimed her attention, and as the shadows lengthened in the store, she realized the morning after was only the beginning of a very long night. The morning air in Elena's apartment usually tasted of stale coffee and the quiet satisfaction of a life well managed, but today it felt thick with a residue she couldn't wash away. She sat at her small kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she cradled a mug that had long since gone cold. Every time she closed her eyes, the dim, velvet-soaked atmosphere of the gilded cage rushed back, along with the phantom pressure of Nikolai Volkov's lips against hers. It had been a $10,000 dare, a moment of reckless rebellion against her own cautious routine, but now it felt like a brand on her skin. She was a creature of anonymity, a woman who had spent years curating an invisible life to escape the overprotective shadows of her past. Yet, the silence of her apartment now felt charged with an electric tension, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the inevitable consequence of her choice. She dressed for work with mechanical precision, selecting a conservative blouse and slacks that served as a suit of armor against the memory of the daring black dress she'd worn the night before. She tried to convince herself that Nikolai Volkov was merely a man, a powerful, dangerous man, certainly, but one with an empire to run and no reason to dwell on a fleeting whim. However, the moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, her neighborhood felt skewed. A black sedan idled at the corner, its tinted windows offering no glimpse inside, yet the hair on her arms stood up as she passed. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, the exact same frantic rhythm she had felt when she first approached Nikolai's corner booth. The sense of being watched was a physical weight. When she ducked into her local coffee shop, her eyes frantically scanned the reflected surfaces of the windows. Across the street, a man in a nondescript gray jacket stood by a newsstand, his gaze fixed too intently on the shop's entrance. He didn't look like a common criminal. He looked like a shadow, professional, disciplined, and perfectly integrated into the morning rush. By the time she reached the high-end boutique where she worked, Elena was breathless, her skin prickling with the certainty that she was being catalogued. Inside the boutique, a small, unmarked box sat on the counter. Her manager, Martha, gave her a curious look, mentioning that a courier had dropped it off just minutes prior with no name attached. Elena's fingers fumbled with the dark ribbon, her breath catching as the lid came away. Resting on a bed of black silk was a single, perfectly preserved gold-dipped rose. There was no note, but the message was louder than a scream. The world of Nikolai Volkov had followed her home. Throughout the morning, the bell above the boutique door became a source of dread. Elena found herself rearranging the same rack of silk scarves repeatedly, her mind spiraling through the lethal reality of Nikolai's business. She had always been a face in the crowd, someone no one bothered to remember. But Nikolai Volkov did not forget. At noon, she retreated to the break room to splash cold water on her face, staring at her reflection, the sharp lines and hidden fire in her eyes that marked her as his target. Then she saw it, a Polaroid pinned to the break room bulletin board. It was a photo of her, taken through the boutique's front window only 20 minutes earlier. She looked entirely unaware, caught mid-sentence with a customer. On the white border, written in elegant, masculine script, was a single word, claimed. The realization that she was being hunted turned her blood to ice. Her invisibility was gone, shattered by a single kiss that had transformed her from a bystander into Nikolai's obsession. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the boutique door opened once more. The bell didn't chime, it seemed to toll. Nikolai Volkov didn't just walk into the room, he commanded the air within it. He was a silhouette of sharp lines and dark gravity, his presence instantly silencing the soft jazz playing over the speakers. The few customers in the store felt the shift, the sudden, suffocating pressure of a predator entering the space, and they retreated toward the exits without knowing why. Nikolai stood in the center of the showroom, his dark hair and cold, symmetrical features looking like they had been carved from stone. Two men flanked him, their bulky frames barely concealing the outlines of weapons beneath their perfectly tailored jackets. He didn't look at the expensive merchandise. His eyes, dark as night and just as bottomless, were fixed solely on Elena. She stood frozen behind the counter, the gold-dipped rose mocking her from its silk bed. He approached her with a slow, calculated grace, each footfall echoing the power he held over the city's underworld. When he reached the counter, he didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his gaze scanning her face with the calculated precision of a man who owned everything he saw. "You look different in the light, Elena," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation of a fact. He reached out, his gloved hand tracing the edge of the box containing the rose. "Did you think a kiss at the Gilded Cage was a game you could walk away from?" Elena swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "It was a dare, Nikolai." It didn't mean anything. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, one that held no warmth. "In my world, nothing is done without meaning. You stepped out of the shadows and chose me. Now you belong to the shadow." He leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming her senses. He demonstrated his total reach not through violence, but through the absolute certainty in his voice. "I know your name, your address, the school your daughter would have attended if you hadn't moved 3 years ago. I know why you hide." The mention of her past, the very thing she had worked so hard to bury, made her knees weak. Nikolai wasn't just a man she had kissed. He was a force of nature that had dismantled her life in less than 24 hours. He turned to his men, a subtle nod signaling them to secure the door. The boutique was now a cage, and the city's most dangerous man was inside with her. Elena realized then that the morning after was over. The long night of Nikolai Volkov had truly begun. The sunlight filtering through the sheer linen curtains of Elena's apartment felt intrusive, a jagged contrast to the dim, velvet-soaked atmosphere of the Gilded Cage that still clung to her skin like humid air. She sat at her small kitchen table, her fingers trembling as she cradled a mug of coffee that had long since surrendered its warmth. Every time she blinked, the phantom pressure of Nikolai Volkov's lips returned, a reckless, $10,000 mistake that now felt like a permanent brand. She was a woman of careful rituals and quiet anonymity, someone who had spent 3 years blending into the background of Harbor City to escape the stifling, overprotective shadows of her past. But this morning, the silence of her apartment felt heavy and charged, as if the very oxygen was waiting for a spark. She dressed for work with mechanical precision, selecting a conservative cream blouse and charcoal slacks, a suit of armor designed to erase the memory of the daring, sleeveless black dress she'd worn for the dare. She tried to rationalize the previous night, telling herself that Nikolai Volkov was just a man, a powerful, lethal man, certainly, but one with a criminal empire to manage. He surely had no space in his cold, calculated mind for a girl who had kissed him on a whim. Yet, as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the familiar geography of her neighborhood felt skewed. A sleek black sedan idled at the far corner, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of the interior, but the hair on her arms stood up as she passed. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, the exact same frantic, uneven rhythm she'd felt when she first approached Nikolai's corner booth. The sense of being catalogued was a physical weight. When she ducked into her local coffee shop, her eyes frantically searched the reflected surfaces of the polished chrome and windows. Across the street, a man in a nondescript gray jacket stood by a newsstand, his gaze fixed too intently on the shop's entrance. He didn't look like a common thug. He looked like a shadow, disciplined, professional, and perfectly integrated into the morning rush. By the time she reached the high-end boutique where she worked, Elena was breathless, her skin prickling with the certainty that she was no longer alone in her own life. Inside the boutique, the air smelled of expensive silk and cedar, a temporary sanctuary that was shattered the moment she saw the small, unmarked box sitting on the glass counter. Her manager, Martha, gave her a curious, almost worried look, mentioning that a courier had dropped it off just minutes prior with no name attached. Elena's fingers fumbled with the dark satin ribbon, her breath hitching as the lid came away. Resting on a bed of midnight black silk was a single, perfectly preserved gold-dipped rose. There was no card, no signature, but the message was louder than a scream. The world of Nikolai Volkov had followed her out of the lounge and into the light of day. Throughout the morning, the bell above the boutique door became a source of mounting dread. Elena found herself rearranging the same rack of cashmere sweaters repeatedly, her mind spiraling through the lethal reality of Nikolai's reputation. She had always been a face in the crowd, a server of the elite who was taught that invisibility was part of the uniform. But Nikolai Volkov did not deal in invisibility. At noon, she retreated to the break room to splash cold water on her face, staring at her reflection, the sharp lines of her face and the hidden fire in her eyes that marked her as his target. Then she saw it, a Polaroid pinned to the corkboard among the shift schedules. It was a photo of her, taken through the boutique's front window only 20 minutes earlier. She was mid-sentence with a customer, looking entirely unaware. On the white border, written in elegant, masculine script, was a single word, claimed. The realization that she was being hunted turned her blood to ice. Her anonymity was gone, liquidated by a single kiss that had transformed her from a bystander into Nikolai's obsession. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the boutique door opened once more. The bell didn't chime, it seemed to toll. Nikolai Volkov didn't just walk into the room, he commanded the very air within it. He was a silhouette of sharp lines and dark gravity, his presence instantly silencing the soft jazz humming over the speakers. The few customers in the store felt the shift, the sudden, suffocating pressure of a predator entering the space, and they retreated toward the exits, driven by an instinct they couldn't name. Nikolai stood in the center of the showroom, his dark hair and cold, symmetrical features looking as if they had been carved from stone. He was taller than most, his shoulders straining against a perfectly tailored black suit. Two men flanked him, their bulky frames failing to conceal the outlines of weapons beneath their jackets. They moved in a perfect, chilling synchronicity, creating a bubble of space around him that no one dared to penetrate. He didn't look at the expensive merchandise. His eyes, dark as night and just as bottomless, were fixed solely on Elena. She stood frozen behind the counter, the gold-dipped rose mocking her from its silk bed. He approached her with a slow, calculated grace. When he reached the counter, he simply looked at her, his gaze scanning her face with the precision of a man who already owned everything he saw. "You look different in the light, Elena," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of possession. He reached out, his gloved hand tracing the edge of the box. "Did you think a kiss at the Gilded Cage was a game you could walk away from?" Elena swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "It was a dare, Nikolai. It didn't mean anything." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, one that held no warmth. "In my world, nothing is done without meaning. You stepped out of the shadows and chose me. Now you belong to the shadow." He leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming her. "I know your name, your address, the school your daughter would have attended if you hadn't moved 3 years ago. I know why you hide." The mention of her past, the very secrets she had worked so hard to bury, made her knees weak. Nikolai wasn't just a man she had kissed. He was a force of nature that had dismantled her carefully constructed life in less than 24 hours. Before she could respond, the front window of the boutique shattered inward. The sound was like a bomb, a violent eruption of glass and screaming metal. Nikolai's men moved instantly, their weapons drawn with terrifying speed as they formed a human shield around him and Elena. Vesta's men, one of the guards hissed, referring to a rival family. The threat wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was blood and lead. Nikolai didn't flinch. He gripped Elena's arm, his touch firm and possessive. "They know you're mine now," he murmured over the chaos. "And they will use you to get to me." He didn't give her a choice. As more black SUVs screeched to a halt outside, Nikolai pulled her toward the rear exit. "If you stay here, you die. If you come with me, you live." The routine of her life was gone, replaced by the roar of engines and the cold weight of a Mafia don't hand on hers. She was thrust into the back of his armored sedan, the door slamming shut with a finality that sounded like a prison cell locking. As the car tore away from the curb, weaving through traffic with lethal intent, Elena looked back at the boutique, her sanctuary, now a ruin of broken glass and smoke. Nikolai sat beside her, his expression unreadable, his eyes already focused on the next move in his deadly game. "You are going to my estate," he stated, not as an invitation, but as an absolute. "It is the only place in the city where you are safe from my enemies." Elena stared at him, the man she had kissed for a dare, realizing she was no longer the invisible server from the Rosewood Hotel. She was a piece on a chessboard she didn't understand, trapped in the golden handcuffs of a man who didn't know how to let go. The high-speed journey toward his fortified estate was a blur of neon lights and adrenaline. She realized then that the morning after was a lie. There was no going back to the sunlit routine of her apartment. She was entering a world where a kiss was a claim, and her only hope for survival lay in the hands of the monster who had claimed her. As the iron gates of the Volkov estate swung open, revealing a fortress of stone and security, Elena felt the last threads of her old life snap. She was his captive, his lucky charm, and perhaps the only person who could see the man behind the stone-cold mask. But first, she had to survive being his queen. Nikolai looked at her then, his gaze softened by a fraction of a degree. "Welcome home, Elena," he whispered, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if the shiver that went down her spine was fear or something far more dangerous. The heavy iron gates of the Volkov estate swung open with a groan that sounded like a final goodbye to Elena's old life. As the armored sedan crunched over the pristine gravel driveway, she caught a glimpse of the fortress that would now be her world. It was a sprawling expanse of cold gray stone and sharp architectural angles, surrounded by walls topped with electrified wire and patrolled by men who carried their lethality as casually as a wristwatch. Beside her, Nikolai Volkov remained a silent, looming presence, his profile as unyielding as the stone walls of his home. The transition from the shattered boutique to this silent sanctuary was jarring. Inside, the estate was a labyrinth of echoing marble hallways and darkened rooms filled with the scent of beeswax and old money. Nikolai led her into a private wing, his hand firm on the small of her back, a touch that was simultaneously protective and possessive. He stopped before a set of double oak doors. "This is your space, Elena," he stated, his voice a low vibration in the quiet hall. "Everything you need has already been provided. Do not leave this wing without an escort." When she stepped inside, she found a suite that was a masterpiece of luxury and isolation. The walk-in closet was already filled with clothes in her exact size, dresses of flowing silk, soft cashmere sweaters, and even a replacement for the black dress she'd worn on the night of the dare. It was a gilded cage in the most literal sense. On the vanity sat a small crystal vase containing a single, fresh gold-dipped rose, an identical twin to the one that had signaled the end of her anonymity. As the days bled into a singular, high-tension blur, Elena began to realize that the stone face Nikolai presented to the world was a meticulously crafted mask. From her balcony, she watched him in the courtyard below. He was often surrounded by his lieutenants, a king presiding over a court of violence, but there were moments when the mask slipped. One evening, she observed him standing alone by a fountain, his shoulders losing their rigid tension as he stared into the water. In the moonlight, the sharp angles of his face seemed to soften, and the calculated precision of a predator was replaced by a look of profound, weary isolation. Her curiosity finally outweighed her fear during the fourth night of her custody. She found Nikolai in his private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and smelling of aged whiskey and tobacco. He was hunched over an old mahogany desk, not with a ledger of criminal enterprises, but with a delicate, silver music box. He didn't look up as she entered, his focus entirely on the tiny, rotating mechanism. "My mother's," he murmured, the usual edge in his voice replaced by a hollow rasp. "The only thing I have left of the woman who didn't want me to become this." He looked up then, and for a fleeting second, his eyes weren't dark as night and bottomless, they were human, filled with a raw, ancient grief that mirrored the loneliness she had felt in her own life of hiding. This glimpse of vulnerability was a dangerous complication. It was easier to fear a monster than to empathize with a man who had been forged by tragedy. "Why me, Nikolai?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the vast room. "Of all the people in that lounge, why go to these lengths for a girl who dared to kiss you?" Nikolai stood, the mask sliding back into place as he walked toward her, his silhouette commanding the space. He stopped inches from her, the air between them thick with a tension that was no longer just about danger. "Because you looked at me and didn't see the city's most dangerous man," he said, his hand rising to trace the line of her jaw. "You saw a man. And for that one moment at the gilded cage, I felt like one." The moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the door. One of his bulky, flanked men entered, his expression urgent. "Boss," Vestas moved. They found a weakness in the outer perimeter. The transition was instantaneous. The grieving son disappeared, replaced by the Mafia Don who everyone in Harbor City knew of and whose name was whispered in fear. Nikolai didn't look back as he grabbed his jacket and checked the weapon concealed beneath it. "Stay in your room, Elena. Lock the door." As he disappeared into the hallway, Elena realized the true weight of her golden handcuffs. She was trapped in a war she didn't choose, tied to a man who was as much a victim of his power as he was its master. The stone face was back, but the memory of his grief remained, a crack in the armor that she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just his claim or his lucky charm, she was the only witness to the man buried beneath the monster, and in the world of Alexander Volov and Nikolai Volkov, that made her the most dangerous person in the room. She returned to her suite, the silence of the estate now punctuated by the distant, rhythmic sound of boots on marble and the clicking of safeties being disengaged. The morning after had evolved into a permanent twilight where the lines between captive and companion were becoming dangerously blurred. She looked at the gold-dipped rose on her vanity and realized she no longer wanted to be invisible. She wanted to know if the fire she saw in Nikolai's eyes was a warning or a beacon, and she was terrified to find out the answer. The silk gown was a masterpiece of midnight lace, a garment that felt more like a silken spiderweb than a dress as it clung to Elena's skin. Standing before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite at the Volkov estate, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The invisible girl who had once blended into the humid background of the Rosewood Hotel was gone, replaced by a creature of sharp elegance and high-stakes consequence. Her hair was swept into a sophisticated updo that exposed the vulnerable line of her neck, and the diamonds at her ears caught the light with the same cold, diamond-like reflection she had once observed from a distance on the city's elite. Nikolai appeared in the doorway, his own presence commanding the space with a gravitational pull that made the air in the room feel thin. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his shoulders straining against the fabric, looking every bit the predator who had conquered the city's underworld. He walked toward her, his eyes scanning her face with that calculated precision she had come to both fear and crave. He didn't offer a compliment. In his world, beauty was expected, and power was the only currency that mattered. He simply reached out and fastened a heavy platinum necklace around her throat. It felt like a collar, the ultimate symbol of his claim over her. "The gala tonight is not just a charity event, Elena," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "It is a declaration. Every eye in Harbor City will be on us. They need to see that you are mine, and they need to see that I am untouchable." The drive to the Grand Metropolitan was a blur of armored glass and silent tension. When they arrived, the subtle disturbance that usually rippled through a crowd when someone important entered was magnified 1,000-fold. The sea of designer gowns and tailored suits parted like the Red Sea as Nikolai led her into the ballroom. Elena felt the weight of 1,000 stares, some filled with curiosity, others with the scent of wealth and entitlement, and many with a whispered fear that made her skin crawl. As the orchestra began a haunting waltz, Nikolai led her to the center of the dance floor. This was the first dance, a public ritual where the city's most dangerous man would display his prize. As they moved in perfect synchronicity, Elena realized the true danger of his world. It wasn't just the bulky men with weapons beneath their jackets or the ruthless efficiency of his business. It was the way the entire room revolved around him, a delicate dance of terror and respect. Every smile offered to them was a mask, every handshake a potential betrayal. Midway through the dance, Elena caught a glimpse of a man near the perimeter, a face from her past that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man was a ghost of the life she had tried to bury, a reminder that even in this fortified estate and under Nikolai's protection, she was never truly safe. The realization shattered the illusion of the evening. She wasn't a guest at a gala, she was a target in a high-stakes game of shadows. As Nikolai spun her, his eyes dark as night and just as bottomless searched hers, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "What is it?" he demanded, his grip on her waist tightening. "I saw someone," she whispered, the fire she usually hid behind a calm exterior flickering with genuine panic. Nikolai didn't flinch. He simply scanned the room with the calculated precision of a predator, his face looking as if it had been carved from stone. He leaned in close, his lips brushing her ear. "No one touches what is mine, Elena. Not tonight, not ever." The rest of the evening was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Nikolai navigated the room with ruthless efficiency, using Elena as both a shield and a statement of his absolute reach and power. She watched as powerful men withered under his gaze and women, dripping in emeralds, looked at her with a mixture of envy and pity. She realized then that being Nikolai Volkov's companion meant living in a world where invisibility was no longer an option. By the time they returned to the estate, the midnight lace of her gown felt like a heavy shroud. Elena stood on her balcony, looking out over the city she no longer recognized. She was claimed, a piece on a chessboard she was only beginning to understand. The morning after had evolved into a permanent twilight, and as she looked at the gold-dipped rose on her vanity, she knew there was no turning back. She had kissed the monster for a dare, and now she would have to learn to survive as his queen in a world built on terror and respect. The silence following the gala was more suffocating than the noise of 1,000 whispering socialites. Back within the cold, high-ceilinged limestone walls of the Volkov estate, the adrenaline that had sustained Elena through the evening began to dissolve, leaving behind a hollow ache of exhaustion. She retreated to the library, a room that smelled of ancient paper and the expensive, peppery tobacco Nikolai favored. It was the only place where the fortress felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. She didn't turn on the lights, allowing the silver moonlight to spill across the parquet floors, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. She heard him before she saw him, the heavy, rhythmic click of Italian leather shoes against marble. Nikolai entered the room, shedding his suit jacket and tossing it over a leather armchair. He didn't look like the untouchable king of the ballroom anymore. His tie was loosened, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and his movements were weighted by a fatigue he never allowed his enemies to see. He crossed to the decanter on the sideboard, the amber liquid catching the moon's glow as he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to Elena without a word, his fingers brushing hers. The heat of that small contact felt more substantial than the entire gala combined. "The man you saw tonight," Nikolai began, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous velvet that always made her pulse skip. "He won't trouble you again." Elena took a cautious sip of the whiskey, the burn in her throat grounding her. "You say that with such certainty, Nikolai. But how many more ghosts are out there? How much blood is on the floor of this empire?" Nikolai walked to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds where his security teams moved like shadows. For a long moment, he was silent, a silhouette of sharp lines and dark gravity against the night. When he spoke again, the usual calculated precision was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged edge. "I didn't choose this life, Elena. I was born into a war that had already claimed my father and my brother before I was old enough to hold a weapon. In Harbor City, you're either the predator or the prey. There is no middle ground." He turned back to her, and for the first time, the stone face fully crumbled. He showed her a faded photograph he kept in his breast pocket, a woman with kind eyes and a smile that had never known the scent of wealth and power. "My mother wanted me to be a musician. She used to hide me in the cellar when the men came for my father, whispering that the world was full of music if I just listened closely enough." He let out a harsh, dry laugh. "The music died the night they burned our house down with her inside. I realized then that the only way to protect anything beautiful in this world is to be more terrifying than the things that want to destroy it." The admission hung in the air, a moment of genuine intimacy that felt more dangerous than a gunshot. Elena saw the crack in the armor, the boy who had been forced to become a monster to survive the fire. She realized that Nikolai's obsession with her wasn't just about a claim or a lucky charm, it was a desperate, subconscious attempt to find a piece of the world that didn't smell of gunpowder and betrayal. She moved toward him, her midnight lace gown rustling softly. She reached out, her hand hovering over his heart before settling there. She could feel the steady, powerful thrumming of a life built on terror and respect. "You think you're protecting me, Nikolai. But you're just pulling me into the cellar with you." He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. "Perhaps. But in the cellar, we aren't alone." The intimacy was intoxicating, a dangerous cocktail of empathy and attraction that complicated everything. Elena knew that by acknowledging the man beneath the mask, she was surrendering her last defense. She was no longer just a captive, she was an accomplice to his humanity. As they stood together in the moonlit library, the morning after and the long night seemed to merge into a single, inescapable reality. Nikolai Volkov had claimed her attention, but now he was beginning to claim her soul. The weight of his past was a physical presence in the room, a history of ruthless efficiency and underworld conquest that had left him as solitary as the little boy she had once seen at the charity gala. In that moment, Elena didn't see the Mafia boss, she saw the musician who had lost his song. She realized that her reckless leap had landed her in a place where the lines between good and evil were blurred by the subtle mixture of entitlement and power that governed Harbor City. She was no longer the invisible server, she was the only one who could see the cold symmetry of his life for what it truly was, a cage made of gold and grief. The fragile piece of the Volkov estate was a construct of high walls and even higher technology, a digital and physical fortress designed to keep the chaos of Harbor City at bay. Within these walls, Elena had begun to find a rhythm, a strange and precarious domesticity shared with a man who was simultaneously her captor and her only protector. But the calculated precision of Nikolai's world relied on total loyalty, and in the underworld, loyalty was often a commodity with a fluctuating market price. While Nikolai spent his nights reinforcing the subtle mixture of entitlement and power that kept his rivals in check, a rot was forming from within, a mole buried deep in the foundation of his organization, ready to sell the location of Nikolai's greatest perceived weakness to his most ruthless enemy. The betrayal didn't begin with a bang, but with a series of quiet, deliberate erosions of security. A digital handshake in a darkened server room, a modified clearance code handed over in a nondescript parking garage, and the silent disabling of the infrared sensors along the estate's northern perimeter. Nikolai had been so focused on external threats, on the Vesta's men, who had shattered the boutique windows, that he hadn't seen the shadow growing in his own house. He was a predator who had outlived his enemies by being more terrifying than them, but he had forgotten that even a king can be brought down by a whisper in the ear of a trusted guard. Elena was in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with exotic flora that smelled of damp earth and blooming orchids, a sharp contrast to the scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey that dominated Nikolai's public life. She was reading by the light of a single lamp when the shift occurred. It wasn't a sound, but a change in the atmosphere, a sudden, heavy stillness that made the hair on her arms stand up. The usual rhythmic hum of the estate's security detail had vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. She looked up, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird, and saw the red laser dot dancing across the leaf of a nearby palm. The mole had done more than just provide a location. They had orchestrated a total blackout of the estate's internal communications. When Nikolai's primary security chief, a man who moved with perfect synchronicity alongside his boss, reached for his radio to report a perimeter breach, he found only dead air. The betrayal was surgical. Within seconds, the fortified estate was breached not by a small team, but by a coordinated strike force representing the Vesta Syndicate, led by the intelligence provided by Nikolai's own inner circle. The golden handcuffs were suddenly no longer a metaphor. Elena was trapped in the center of a kill zone, her only protection currently blocks away in the main house, unaware that his claim was being liquidated. Nikolai was in his study, the stone-cold mask firmly in place as he reviewed logistics for a shipment of business that kept the city's underworld under his thumb. When the lights flickered and died, he didn't reach for a flashlight. He reached for the weapon concealed beneath his perfectly tailored black suit. He moved with the ruthless efficiency that had made his name synonymous with terror, sliding into the shadows before the first door was kicked in. But even as he neutralized the first two intruders, the realization hit him with the force of a lead pipe. The intruders weren't coming for him. They were moving toward the conservatory. The mole hadn't sold him out for his life. They had sold him out for Elena's. In the conservatory, Elena scrambled behind a heavy stone planter as the glass walls shattered inward. The sound was a violent repetition of the boutique attack, a cacophony of broken glass and smoke that erased the peaceful sense of the garden. She could see them now, men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks, moving with a lethal intent that made the subtle disturbance of the gala seem like child's play. They didn't fire wildly. They were looking for her. They were here to take Nikolai's lucky charm and use her to dismantle everything he had built. She realized then that her invisibility was truly dead. She was the most valuable piece on the board, and the game had just turned bloody. The firefight that erupted as Nikolai's loyal guards clashed with the Vesta strike force was a blur of muzzle flashes and sharp angles of movement. Nikolai arrived like a force of nature, his eyes dark as night and just as bottomless, filled with a cold, focused rage. He didn't just fight. He commanded the space, carving a path toward Elena with a desperation that shattered his usual, calculated precision. He reached her just as a Vesta operative grabbed her arm, his touch a violent echo of Nikolai's own possessiveness. Nikolai didn't hesitate. The ruthless efficiency that defined him was on full display as he neutralized the threat and pulled Elena into the safety of his shadow. But the victory was hollow. As the remaining intruders retreated into the night, Nikolai stood amidst the ruins of his conservatory, the scent of wealth replaced by the metallic tang of blood and cordite. He looked at Elena, his breath shallow, his perfectly tailored appearance finally destroyed. The betrayal was confirmed when he found the modified clearance device on the body of one of his own men, a lieutenant he had trusted for a decade. The realization that his own empire had a rot in its heart was a blow more significant than any physical wound. His stone face didn't just crack, it fell away entirely, leaving behind a man who realized that even his fortified estate was a lie. "We have to leave," Nikolai stated, his voice a rasping command that brooked no argument. He gripped her hand, his touch firm and bruising. "The mole is still inside. The walls aren't safe anymore." He looked at her then, a flicker of that raw, ancient grief she had seen in the library returning to his eyes. He had tried to protect her by bringing her into his cellar, but he had only succeeded in making her the primary target in a war that had no end. The morning after was a distant memory, replaced by a long night that was now entering its most dangerous phase. As they moved toward the secret egress beneath the estate, Elena looked back at the gilded cage she had called home for the past week. It was a ruin of broken glass and smoke, a testament to the fact that in the world of the most dangerous man in the city, there was no such thing as a sanctuary. She was no longer just a captive or a lucky charm, she was a survivor of a betrayal that had leveled the playing field. She looked at Nikolai, the man she had kissed for a dare, and realized that her only hope for survival lay in becoming as ruthless as the man who had claimed her. The first dance was over. The real war had begun. The cold, damp darkness of the subterranean cellar felt like a tomb, a jagged irony considering Nikolai's mother had once used such a place to hide him from the light of violence. Elena sat on the freezing concrete floor, her wrists chafed by heavy plastic zip ties that bit into her skin with every shallow breath. The scent of damp earth and rot replaced the expensive cedar and whiskey of the Volkov estate, a sensory reminder that she was no longer in the gilded cage, but had been dragged into the lion's den. The men who had taken her, Vesta's strike force, didn't look at her with the possessive, simmering intensity Nikolai did. They looked at her like a bargaining chip, a piece of meat to be traded for territory. Her mind reeled as she tried to reconstruct the chaos of the conservatory breach. She remembered the shattering glass, Nikolai's desperate shout, and then the sickening impact of a weapon's butt against her temple. She had woken up here, in the dark, with a pounding headache that pulsed in time with the singular, terrifying realization. She was the only leverage they had against the most dangerous man in Harbor City. The mole within Nikolai's organization had done their job perfectly, stripping away the ruthless efficiency of his protection and delivering her directly to his greatest rival. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, spilling a blade of harsh, yellow light across the room. A man descended, his shadow stretching long and monstrous against the wall. He wasn't the predator Nikolai was. He was a scavenger, a man named Marco Vesta who had spent years living in Nikolai's shadow, waiting for a crack in the armor. He stopped a few feet from her, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete, a mocking echo of the calculated precision she had grown used to. "So you're the one," Vesta sneered, his voice thin and sharp, lacking the dangerous velvet of Nikolai's tone. "The little server who managed to put a leash on the Volkov wolf. I expected someone more substantial." Elena looked up at him, her fire flickering despite the terror. "He's going to burn this city to the ground to find me." Vesta laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Let him try. By the time he figures out which basement you're rotting in, he'll have signed over every port and warehouse he owns. You aren't just a woman to him, Elena. You're his lucky charm. And I'm going to break his luck. As Vesta left her back in the darkness, Elena felt a strange, shifting clarity. In the silence of her captivity, she stopped fighting the truth she had been suppressing since the night of the dare. She didn't just fear Nikolai. She didn't just feel empathy for the boy buried beneath the monster. She loved him. The depth of that love hit her with more force than the blow to her head. It was a dangerous cocktail of devotion born from seeing the raw, ancient grief in his eyes and the way he had commanded the space just to reach her in the conservatory. She began to stall. Every time a guard entered to check her bindings or offer a cup of tepid water, she fed them fragments of misinformation, whispering about secret Volkov protocols and hidden emergency frequencies she'd overheard in the estate. She used the invisibility she had mastered over 3 years of serving the elite, becoming a non-threatening, talkative captive who absorbed every detail of her surroundings. She noticed the rhythmic ticking of a boiler, the specific sequence of the guard rotations, and the way the light shifted through a high, barred window. She wasn't just stalling for Nikolai, she was stalling to give herself time to become the queen he believed she was. She realized that being claimed wasn't about being a trophy, it was about being the only one who could stand beside him in the fire. Every minute she kept Vesta talking, every second she played the part of the scared server, was a second closer to Nikolai's inevitable arrival. The weight of the gold-dipped rose she had left on her vanity felt like a phantom pressure in her palm. She understood now that Nikolai didn't just want to protect her, he wanted her to be the reason he stayed human. In the darkness of the lion's den, Elena stopped being the girl who took a dare and became the woman who would do anything to return to the shadow of the man she loved. She sat in the silence, her heart no longer hammering like a trapped bird, but beating with the steady, ruthless efficiency of a Volkov. She was waiting, and she knew that when the doors finally blew off their hinges, it wouldn't be a rescue, it would be a homecoming. The thunderous roar of a breaching charge finally silenced the taunts of the Vesta guards, shattering the heavy iron door of the cellar and signaling the arrival of the man who had turned Harbor City into his personal chessboard. Nikolai Volkov didn't just enter the room. He descended like an avenging shadow, his eyes dark as night and just as bottomless, reflecting the cold, calculated fury of a predator whose most precious claim had been touched. He moved with a ruthless efficiency that made the tactical precision of the Vesta strike force look like amateur theater. Before the guards could even raise their weapons, they were neutralized, silenced by the silent, lethal synchronicity of the men flanking their dawn. Nikolai didn't stop until he was on his knees in the damp dirt, his hands, usually so steady and cold, trembling as he reached for the zip ties on Elena's wrists. He didn't look at the carnage behind him or the scavenger Marco Vesta, who lay broken in the corner. He looked only at her, his stone-cold mask completely gone, replaced by a raw, ancient grief and a desperate, burning relief. "I found you," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp that vibrated against her skin as he pulled her into the protective circle of his arms. "I will never let the shadows touch you again." Elena clung to him, the scent of gunpowder and his expensive, peppery tobacco finally grounding her. The lion's den was no longer a tomb, it was the site of her final transformation. She realized that the invisible server had died in that conservatory, and the woman who emerged from this rescue was something new, someone forged in blood and roses. In the weeks that followed, the Volkov estate was rebuilt, not as a gilded cage, but as the center of a new, dark partnership. Nikolai didn't return her to her studio apartment or her quiet routine. He brought her to his side at the mahogany desk in the library. He taught her the language of his world, the subtle mixture of entitlement and power that kept the city in check. He showed her that invisibility could be a weapon, and that her sharp, observant nature was the perfect counterbalance to his ruthless efficiency. They established a rule of two. Elena became the ghost in his machine, the one who saw the cracks in the armor before they became fatal, while Nikolai remained the iron fist that protected her fire. The city whispered of the Russian who had conquered the underworld and the queen who had softened his stone-cold heart, though they both knew the truth was far more complex. She hadn't softened him, she had given his violence a purpose. As they stood together on the balcony of their fortified home, looking out over a city that now bowed to them both, Nikolai reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh gold-dipped rose. He didn't just hand it to her, he placed it in her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that was no longer a claim, but a covenant. "The dare is over, Elena," he murmured, his gaze scanning the horizon with the calculated precision of a predator who finally had everything he needed. "This is the reality." Elena looked at the rose, then at the man beside her, the Mafia boss she had kissed on a whim. She wasn't his captive or his lucky charm anymore. She was his equal in the dark. "I know," she replied, her voice no longer small or practiced, but filled with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had finally found her place. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." The morning after had finally become a permanent, powerful dawn. Together, they were the terror and respect that Harbor City feared, a partnership built on the wreckage of their pasts and the bloody, beautiful certainty of their future.